I was sitting at my kitchen table in my newly renovated house in Chandler, Arizona, drinking my morning coffee when I heard the doorbell ring with that aggressive, rapid-fire pattern that could only mean one thing. The HOA was here. I had moved into this development called Pleasant Valley Estates 6 months ago, and it had been relatively peaceful until about 2 weeks back when I started my renovation project. The house itself was gorgeous, a modern build with clean lines and plenty of windows that let in the desert sun. I had saved for years to afford this place, and when I finally got the keys, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. The radiant floor heating system I had installed was my pride and joy. Living in Arizona, you might think heating is not a priority, but the winters can get surprisingly cold, especially at night. I had done my research, hired the best contractors, and installed a state-of-the-art hydronic radiant floor heating system throughout the main living areas. The installation cost me about $40,000, which was a significant chunk of my savings, but it was worth every penny. The system was energy efficient, comfortable, and added real value to my home. I opened the door to find Patricia Miller standing there with her clipboard, her bleached blonde hair styled in that typical soccer mom cut, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Patricia was the president of the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA, and she took her job more seriously than a heart surgeon in an operating room. "Good morning, Patricia," I said, trying to sound pleasant even though I could already feel the tension building in my shoulders. "Mr. Brian Thompson," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "We need to have a serious discussion about your recent home improvements." I leaned against the door frame, not inviting her in. "What about them? May I come inside? This is not a conversation for the doorstep." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. Patricia walked into my living room with the air of someone conducting an inspection, her eyes scanning everything as if looking for code violations. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her perfume was so strong it made my eyes water. "Nice place," she said, though her tone suggested she meant the opposite. "I have been reviewing the architectural modification requests, and I noticed you never submitted one for your heating system upgrade." "I did not realize I needed to," I said, crossing my arms. "The work was done entirely inside my home. According to the HOA guidelines I received when I purchased the property, interior modifications do not require approval unless they affect the exterior appearance or structural integrity of the building." Patricia's jaw tightened. "That may be technically correct, but we like to be informed of all significant changes to properties in our community. It helps us maintain property values and ensure everyone is making appropriate choices." "Appropriate choices," I repeated, feeling my irritation rising. "What exactly is inappropriate about installing a heating system?" She pulled out a folder from her oversized designer handbag and flipped it open. "I have been doing some research, Mr. Thompson. Radiant floor heating systems of the type you have installed typically cost between $30,000 and $50,000. That is an excessive expenditure that could artificially inflate property values in our neighborhood and create unrealistic expectations for future buyers." I stared at her, genuinely confused. "You are upset that I am improving my home because it might make other homes look bad by comparison." "That is not what I said," Patricia snapped. "What I am saying is that we have community standards. We cannot have homeowners engaging in frivolous, expensive modifications that disrupt the market equilibrium of our development." "Frivolous?" I could feel my blood pressure rising. "Installing an energy-efficient heating system is frivolous." "The cost is what concerns us," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made me want to throw her out immediately. $40,000 for heating in Arizona. That is absurd. You could have installed a perfectly adequate HVAC system for a fraction of that cost. How do you even know how much I spent? I asked, suddenly realizing something was very wrong here. Patricia's face flushed slightly. We have our sources. As HOA president, it is my responsibility to stay informed about significant expenditures that could affect our community. Your sources, I said slowly, my anger now mixing with genuine alarm. You mean you have been snooping into my private financial information? I would hardly call it snooping. Your contractor mentioned the project to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and naturally, the information made its way to me. Naturally, I echoed. So the HOA gossip mill has been tracking my spending. That is absolutely none of your business, Patricia. Her eyes flashed with anger. Everything that happens in this community is the HOA's business, Mr. Thompson. That is what you signed up for when you bought here. I signed up for reasonable rules about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. I did not sign up for the HOA president acting like she has the right to monitor my personal finances and dictate how I spend my money inside my own home. The HOA board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow night at 7, Patricia said, switching tactics. We expect you to attend and provide a full explanation for this excessive expenditure. We will be discussing whether sanctions are appropriate. Sanctions for what exactly? I have not violated any rules. We will let the board determine that, she said, heading toward the door. 7 p.m. tomorrow, at the community center. Do not be late. She left before I could respond, and I stood there in my living room, staring at the closed door and wondering what kind of nightmare I had gotten myself into. I had heard horror stories about HOAs before moving in, but Pleasant Valley Estates had seemed reasonable. The rules were straightforward, the fees were not outrageous, and the neighborhood was beautiful. I never imagined they would try to control what I did inside my own home. I spent the rest of that day researching Arizona HOA laws and my rights as a homeowner. What I found was both encouraging and disturbing. On one hand, HOAs in Arizona had fairly broad powers to regulate communities and enforce rules. On the other hand, there were clear limits to their authority, particularly regarding interior modifications that did not affect common areas or the exterior appearance of properties. The next evening, I arrived at the community center at 6:45, wanting to be early but not too early. The community center was a nice facility, with a gym, a pool, and several meeting rooms. The HOA board meetings were held in the largest conference room, which could seat about 50 people. When I walked in, I was surprised to see that the room was already half full. Apparently, word had spread about my heating system, and my neighbors were curious about the drama. I recognized several faces from the handful of community events I had attended, but I did not know most of these people by name. Patricia was at the front of the room, arranging papers on the conference table where the board members would sit. She was wearing another pantsuit, this one navy blue, and she had her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. The other board members started filtering in. Richard Daniels, the vice president, a retired accountant who always looked vaguely disapproving of everything. Susan Martinez, the secretary, who seemed nice enough but completely dominated by Patricia. And James Chen, the treasurer, who I had talked to a few times at neighborhood barbecues and who struck me as relatively reasonable. At exactly 7 p.m., Patricia called the meeting to order. She went through the usual preliminaries, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the landscaping budget, and addressing a complaint about someone's Christmas lights still being up in February. Then she got to what everyone was really there for. Item 7 on tonight's agenda, Patricia announced, her voice carrying across the room. Unauthorized and excessive interior modifications at 2847 Desert Sage Lane, property owner Brian Thompson. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I had taken a seat in the middle of the room, and now I suddenly felt very exposed. Mr. Thompson, Patricia continued, would you like to explain to the board and your neighbors why you felt it was appropriate to install a $40,000 heating system without consulting the HOA? I stood up, trying to keep my voice calm and level. I installed a radiant floor heating system in my home because I wanted efficient, comfortable heating. I did not consult the HOA because, according to the CC and Articus I received when I purchased my property, interior modifications do not require approval. That may be the letter of the law, Patricia said, but it certainly violates the spirit of community cooperation and transparency that we value here at Pleasant Valley Estates. With all due respect, Patricia, you are not entitled to transparency about what I do inside my home. I pay my HOA dues on time. I keep my lawn maintained, and I follow all the rules regarding exterior appearance. What I choose to spend on interior improvements is my business and mine alone. $40,000 is an excessive amount, Richard Daniels chimed in, his nasal voice grating on my nerves. It suggests a lack of financial prudence that could impact the community. How exactly would my heating system impact the community? I asked. It is invisible from the outside. It does not make noise. It does not affect my neighbors in any way. It sets a precedent, Patricia said. If we allow you to make these kinds of extravagant improvements without oversight, where does it end? What is to stop someone from installing gold-plated faucets or marble imported from Italy? Nothing should stop them, I said, my frustration building. That is the whole point of owning property. Within reason and within the law, people should be able to do what they want with their homes. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people seemed to be nodding in agreement with me, but others looked scandalized by the very idea of homeowners having that much freedom. Mr. Thompson, Susan Martinez said, speaking up for the first time. Her voice was softer than Patricia's, almost apologetic. I think what we are trying to say is that we are concerned about the financial implications. If your property value goes up significantly because of these improvements, it could affect the tax assessments for the entire neighborhood. That was actually a more reasonable concern, and I softened my tone a bit when I responded to her. I understand that concern, Susan, but property improvements generally benefit everyone in a neighborhood. Higher property values mean more equity for all homeowners. And besides, one heating system is not going to dramatically shift the tax assessment for the entire development. You are missing the point, Patricia interjected. This is about community standards and expectations. We have worked hard to create a certain type of neighborhood here. We do not want to become known as the development with overpriced, pretentious homes. Pretentious. I felt my anger returning. Installing a heating system is pretentious. A $40,000 heating system certainly is, Richard said. How much I spent is none of your damn business, I shot back, my patience finally running out. You have no right to police my spending or to call me pretentious for making my home more comfortable. This is completely outrageous. Mr. Thompson, please watch your language, Patricia said primly. There are standards of decorum at these meetings. Standards of decorum. You have been gossiping about my private finances, calling emergency meetings to publicly shame me, and lecturing me about how I spend my own money, and you want to talk about decorum. James Chen cleared his throat. "If I may interject," he said, and everyone turned to look at him. "I have been reviewing our governing documents, and I think Mr. Thompson has a point. The CC and Articus are very clear that interior modifications are at the discretion of the homeowner as long as they do not violate building codes or affect the exterior appearance of the property. I do not see a legal basis for the HOA to take action here." Patricia's face turned red. "James, we discussed this before the meeting. The board agreed that we needed to take a stand." "You and Richard agreed," James said. "Susan and I had reservations, which I am now voicing publicly. I do not think we have any grounds to sanction Mr. Thompson, and I think pursuing this further could open the HOA up to legal liability." "Legal liability?" Patricia scoffed. "For what?" "For harassment," I said. "For violation of privacy, for overstepping your authority. Take your pick." The room erupted in conversation, people talking over each other, some supporting me and others supporting Patricia. I could see the neighborhood was clearly divided on this issue. Patricia banged her gavel, which seemed like overkill for a homeowners association meeting, but that was Patricia for you. "Order. We will have order." When the room quieted down, she continued. "The board will take Mr. Thompson's case under advisement and vote on appropriate action at our next meeting. In the meantime, Mr. Thompson, you are to cease all further modifications to your property until this matter is resolved." "No," I said simply. "Excuse me," I said no. "I am not ceasing anything. I have not violated any rules, and you have no authority to issue that order. If you try to enforce it, I will sue the HOA for harassment and overreach." Patricia looked like she wanted to explode, but James Chen spoke up again. "He is right, Patricia. We cannot issue that kind of blanket order without cause. I move that we table this issue and seek legal counsel before proceeding further." "I second that motion," Susan said quickly. Richard looked like he wanted to object, but even he could see that continuing this fight right now was a losing battle. "Fine," he said. "We will table it." Patricia looked betrayed by her own board, but she had no choice but to accept the motion. "Very well. This matter is tabled pending legal review." Meeting adjourned. I left the community center feeling both vindicated and exhausted. Several neighbors approached me in the parking lot, some to offer support and others to tell me they thought I was causing unnecessary trouble. One guy, a younger man named Derek who lived a few houses down, told me he thought the whole thing was ridiculous and offered to testify on my behalf if things escalated. "I bought a house here because I wanted a nice place to live," Derek said. "Not because I wanted to join some cult where Patricia Miller gets to control every aspect of our lives. Good for you for standing up to her." I thanked him and drove home, my mind racing with thoughts about what would come next. I had been honest when I told Patricia I would sue if necessary, but I really did not want things to go that far. Lawsuits were expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. I just wanted to live in my house in peace. The next few weeks were tense. I continued going about my business, but I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on me whenever I was outside. Patricia and Richard started what could only be described as a campaign against me. They sent out a newsletter to all residents talking about the importance of community values and fiscal responsibility, clearly aimed at me even though they did not mention me by name. Then things escalated in a way I had not expected. I came home from work one day to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, informing me that I was being fined $500 for non-compliance with community standards and failure to submit required architectural modification requests. I was furious. They were now inventing violations to justify their harassment. I immediately called James Chen, the treasurer, who I had come to see as the only reasonable person on the board. "James, did you know about this fine?" I asked when he answered. He sighed heavily. "I found out about it this afternoon." Patricia and Richard pushed it through without a full board vote. Susan and I both objected, but they claimed emergency authority to issue fines for violations. "What violations? I have not violated anything." "I know. I am drafting my resignation from the board tonight. I cannot be part of this anymore. What they are doing is wrong and probably illegal." "James, you do not have to resign. I am going to fight this." "I know you are, and I want you to know you have my full support, but I cannot stay on a board that is actively harassing a homeowner. It goes against everything I believe in." After I hung up with James, I called a lawyer. I had been hoping to avoid this step, but the HOA had left me no choice. The lawyer I contacted, Michelle Anderson, specialized in HOA disputes and had an excellent reputation. When I met with Michelle the following day at her office in downtown Chandler, I laid out everything that had happened. She listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. "This is fairly egregious," Michelle said when I finished. "HOAs have broad authority, but they are not unlimited. What they are doing here appears to be retaliatory and without basis in your governing documents. The fine they issued is particularly problematic because it seems they did not follow proper procedure." "What are my options?" I asked. "We can file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, violation of your rights as a homeowner, and improper assessment of fines. We can also file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA licensing and can investigate misconduct. Given what you have told me, I think we have a strong case. How long will this take? These things can drag on for months, unfortunately. But in the meantime, I can file for an injunction to prevent the HOA from taking any further action against you while the case is pending." "Let us do it," I said. I was tired of being pushed around. Michelle drafted the lawsuit that week, and we filed it in Maricopa County Superior Court. The lawsuit named the HOA as a defendant, as well as Patricia Miller and Richard Daniels personally for their roles in the harassment. The complaint detailed everything that had happened, from the initial confrontation about my heating system to the improper fine. When the HOA received the lawsuit, Patricia apparently lost her mind. I heard from Derek, my neighbor, that she had gone door to door trying to rally support for the HOA and turn people against me. Some people were sympathetic to her, but others were starting to see her behavior as unhinged. "She showed up at my door at 8 p.m. last night," Derek told me, "ranting about how you were trying to destroy the community and how we all needed to band together against you. I told her she was crazy and closed the door in her face." The situation got even more interesting when I received a call from Susan Martinez, the HOA secretary. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed, curious about what she wanted to say. We met at a Starbucks near the development. Susan looked nervous, glancing around as if worried someone might see us together. "I want to apologize for what has been happening," Susan said as soon as we sat down. "When I joined the HOA board, I thought it would be a nice way to contribute to the community. I never imagined it would turn into this." "What made you reach out to me?" I asked. After James resigned, I started really looking into what Patricia and Richard have been doing. "Brian, it is worse than you think. They have been targeting other homeowners too, not just you. There is a couple on Willow Street who put in a swimming pool last year, and Patricia has been harassing them about the pool pump being too loud, even though it meets all the noise ordinances. There is another guy who painted his front door a slightly different shade of brown than approved, and they fined him 3 times until he changed it back. Why have not these people fought back? Most people do not want the hassle. They just give in to avoid the conflict. But what Patricia did to you was so extreme that it woke me up to how abusive she has become. Are you willing to testify about this if the case goes to trial? Susan hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I am also resigning from the board, effective immediately. I cannot be part of this anymore. Over the next month, my lawyer worked on building the case. We subpoenaed HOA records and discovered that Patricia and Richard had been systematically targeting homeowners who they perceived as not fitting their vision for the community. The records showed a pattern of selective enforcement and harassment that went back almost 2 years. Even more damning, we discovered that Patricia had been accessing private information about homeowners without authorization. She had a friend who worked at a local contracting company, and that friend had been feeding her information about what various homeowners were spending on their properties. This was not just unethical, it was potentially illegal. The court granted our motion for an injunction, ordering the HOA to cease all enforcement actions against me pending the outcome of the case. The fine they had issued was suspended, and they were barred from issuing any new fines or violations against my property. Patricia responded by doubling down. She sent out another newsletter, this one explicitly naming me and accusing me of trying to bankrupt the HOA with frivolous litigation. This was a huge mistake on her part because it gave us grounds to add defamation to the lawsuit. Then things took an unexpected turn. An investigative reporter from the Arizona Republic, the major newspaper in Phoenix, got wind of the story. Apparently, HOA abuse was a hot topic in Arizona, and my case was particularly egregious. The reporter, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, contacted me and asked if I would be willing to talk about what happened. I checked with Michelle first, and she said it was fine as long as I stuck to the facts and did not make any inflammatory statements. So I agreed to an interview. Jennifer came to my house with a photographer, and we spent 2 hours talking about the situation. She was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the HOA's behavior and the legal case. She also interviewed several of my neighbors, including Derek and Susan Martinez. When the article came out a week later, it was front-page news in the local section. The headline read, "Chandler HOA accused of systematic harassment of homeowners." The article detailed my case, but also included information about other homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia and Richard. It painted a picture of an HOA board run amok, using its power to bully residents rather than serve them. The reaction was immediate and intense. The story was picked up by local TV news stations, and suddenly reporters were camped out in Pleasant Valley estates. Patricia refused to comment, but that did not stop the media from covering the story extensively. The Arizona Department of Real Estate announced they were opening an investigation into the HOA's practices. The management company that handled the HOA's day-to-day operations issued a statement distancing themselves from the board's actions and saying they had repeatedly advised against the enforcement actions taken against me. Within the community, the mood shifted dramatically. Homeowners who had been silent before started speaking up about their own experiences with Patricia and Richard. A petition started circulating demanding that Patricia resign as HOA president. Within 3 days, it had signatures from over 70% of the homeowners in the development. Patricia still refused to resign. She called an emergency meeting to defend herself, but it backfired spectacularly. The meeting was packed, with over 100 people crammed into the community center. Patricia tried to present her side of the story, talking about the importance of maintaining standards and how I had disrespected the community. But the crowd was not having it. People started shouting questions at her, demanding to know why she thought she had the right to monitor people's private spending. Someone asked about her unauthorized access to homeowners' financial information, and she got flustered, denying it even though we had documentary evidence. Then Derek stood up and dropped a bombshell. "I have been doing some research," he said, "and I found something interesting. According to the HOA's financial records, which are public information, the board has been spending thousands of dollars on legal fees and consulting fees that have not been properly documented. Patricia, can you explain where that money went?" Patricia's face went white. "Those are standard operational expenses." "Standard," Derek pressed. "You spent $8,000 on legal consulting last quarter, but we have not been involved in any legal action until Brian's case. What was that money for?" Richard Daniels tried to jump in to defend Patricia, but people were now calling for a full financial audit. James Chen, who was in the audience, stood up and said he would volunteer to conduct the audit since he had the expertise. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with Patricia banging her gavel and demanding order, but no one was listening to her anymore. Eventually, she just gathered her things and left, with Richard following behind her like a lost puppy. The next week, James conducted his audit with the help of an independent accountant. What they found was shocking. Patricia and Richard had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as legitimate business costs. Patricia had billed the HOA for expensive dinners at restaurants, claiming they were board meetings. Richard had charged the HOA for a laptop and a tablet that he claimed were for HOA business, but were actually for his personal use. In total, they had misappropriated nearly $15,000 over the past year and a half. This was no longer just a civil matter. This was criminal. James turned over the audit results to the Chandler Police Department, who opened an investigation into embezzlement and fraud. Michelle advised me that the criminal investigation actually strengthened our civil case. When there is evidence of criminal conduct by the defendants, it makes the case for harassment and abuse of authority much more compelling, she explained. The police investigation moved surprisingly quickly. They obtained warrants for Patricia's and Richard's bank records and found clear evidence that they had been depositing HOA funds into their personal accounts. They had tried to be clever about it, using the management company's payment system to make it look legitimate, but the paper trail was clear once investigators started looking. 2 months after I had filed my initial lawsuit, Patricia Miller and Richard Daniels were arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The arrest made the news again, with reporters talking about how an HOA dispute over a heating system had uncovered a criminal scheme. I wish I could say I felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. This whole situation had consumed months of my life and caused me tremendous stress. Yes, I was going to win my lawsuit, and yes, the people who had harassed me were facing justice, but it had taken such an enormous toll. The HOA, now under new leadership, dropped all claims against me and agreed to a settlement. They paid my legal fees, issued a formal apology, and amended the governing documents to make it crystal clear that homeowners had the right to make interior modifications without HOA approval. The settlement also included a provision that the HOA would undergo governance training and implement new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Patricia and Richard's criminal case went to trial 6 months later. I had to testify about the harassment I experienced, which was difficult but necessary. The prosecution built a strong case showing a pattern of abuse of power and financial mismanagement. The jury found both of them guilty on all counts. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Richard got 12 months and was also ordered to pay restitution. They both appealed, but the convictions were upheld. The Pleasant Valley Estates HOA elected a completely new board, including Derek and several other level-headed neighbors. They promised a new approach focused on reasonable enforcement of necessary rules and respect for homeowners' rights. James Chen agreed to come back as treasurer to help restore financial accountability. My lawsuit was settled before it went to trial. In addition to paying my legal fees, the HOA paid me $25,000 in damages for the harassment and emotional distress I had endured. More importantly, they agreed to policy changes that would protect other homeowners from similar treatment in the future. Michelle told me that my case had become something of a landmark in Arizona HOA law. Other homeowners were using it as precedent to challenge overreaching HOAs, and some state legislators were talking about strengthening homeowner protections in the law. As for my radiant floor heating system, it continued to work beautifully. On cool winter mornings, I loved walking across my warm floors and thinking about how this whole crazy situation had started. My heating system was nobody's business but my own, and I had been willing to fight to defend that principle. The experience taught me some important lessons. First, that homeowners associations can be wonderful when run by reasonable people with the community's best interests at heart, but they can become nightmares when taken over by petty tyrants. Second, that standing up for your rights is important, even when it is difficult and stressful. If I had just backed down when Patricia first confronted me, she would have continued to abuse her power, and other homeowners would have continued to suffer. Third, I learned that communities are stronger when people look out for each other. The support I received from neighbors like Derek and Susan was crucial, not just practically, but emotionally. It reminded me that most people are decent and want to do the right thing, even if they are sometimes reluctant to speak up. A year after the whole ordeal began, I was finally able to relax and enjoy my home the way I had originally intended. The neighborhood had stabilized under new leadership, and the toxic atmosphere that Patricia and Richard had created was gone. People were friendlier, more relaxed, and less afraid of arbitrary enforcement actions. I ran into Susan Martinez at the grocery store one day, and she told me she was glad everything had worked out. "You know," she said, "I feel like I got my neighborhood back." For a while there, I was actually thinking about moving because Patricia made living here so stressful. Now I remember why I bought here in the first place. That summed it up perfectly. Pleasant Valley Estates was actually a pleasant place to live now, the way it should have been all along. I also became something of an accidental activist in the HOA reform movement. I was invited to speak at a community forum about HOA abuse, and I shared my story with other homeowners who were dealing with similar issues. I gave them Michelle's contact information and encouraged them to stand up for their rights. One guy came up to me after the forum and shook my hand vigorously. "Thank you for fighting back," he said. "My HOA has been harassing me about my vegetable garden, saying it is not aesthetically appropriate. After hearing your story, I am going to hire a lawyer and push back." I hoped his situation would not escalate the way mine had, but I was glad he was standing up for himself. No one should have to live in fear in their own home, constantly worried about arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. My house in Chandler became exactly what I wanted it to be: a comfortable, peaceful retreat where I could relax after work and enjoy my life. The radiant floor heating kept me warm on cool nights, and every time I appreciated its comfort, I remembered that I had fought for the right to have it. The whole experience also changed how I viewed property ownership and community living. I used to think that buying a house was primarily a financial transaction, a way to build equity and have a place to call my own. Now, I understood that it was also about rights, responsibilities, and the importance of good governance. I stayed involved with the HOA, attending meetings regularly and serving on a committee to review and update the governing documents. The new board welcomed input from residents and made decisions transparently, which was a refreshing change from Patricia's secretive, authoritarian approach. Derek and I became good friends through all of this. We would get together for beers sometimes and laugh about the absurdity of how a heating system had turned into a criminal investigation. "You should write a book about this," Derek said one evening as we sat on my back patio. "I bet a lot of people would want to hear the story." Maybe I would someday. For now, I was content to live my life, enjoy my home, and know that I had stood up for what was right when it mattered. The legal precedent from my case did have lasting effects beyond just Pleasant Valley estates. Several other HOA disputes in Arizona cited my case in their arguments, and in at least 2 instances that I knew of, homeowners successfully defended against overreaching HOAs by pointing to the settlement and court rulings in my situation. Michelle told me she had taken on 3 new clients who were dealing with similar HOA harassment, and she was optimistic about their chances because of the groundwork laid by my case. "You did something important," she said. "You did not just fight for yourself. You fought for every homeowner who is tired of being bullied by power-hungry board members." That meant more to me than the financial settlement ever could. Knowing that my willingness to fight back had helped other people made the stress and difficulty worth it. As time passed, the story became somewhat legendary in Chandler. People who did not even live in my neighborhood knew about the heating system case and the HOA president who went to prison. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability. Patricia was released from prison after serving 13 months of her 18-month sentence, getting credit for good behavior. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to a different part of the state and kept a very low profile. Richard got out after 9 months and also left the area. I did not wish them ill, but I was glad they were gone and that they had faced consequences for their actions. The HOA insurance company ended up paying a significant portion of the settlement to me, which caused them to drop Pleasant Valley Estates as a client. The new board had to find new insurance, and the premiums were higher because of the claims history. This caused some grumbling among homeowners about rising HOA fees, but the new board president, a retired engineer named Paul Strickland, explained the situation clearly at a meeting. "We are paying more for insurance because the previous board engaged in illegal conduct and harassment," Paul said. "This is the consequence of poor governance. Moving forward, we will operate transparently and within the law, which should help bring our costs back down over time." Most people accepted this explanation, understanding that you cannot engage in criminal activity and expect there to be no financial consequences. My relationship with the HOA was now completely different. Instead of being an adversary, I was a valued member of the community who contributed to making it better. I volunteered to help with the Neighborhood Watch program and participated in community events. It felt good to be part of something positive instead of constantly fighting. One thing that surprised me was how many people privately thanked me for taking on Patricia. People I barely knew would approach me at the mailbox or the community pool and tell me stories about how Patricia had made their lives difficult. One elderly woman told me that Patricia had harassed her about her rose bushes, claiming they were overgrown and needed to be trimmed, even though they were beautiful and well-maintained. "I trimmed them back because I did not want trouble," the woman said, "but it broke my heart. Those roses were planted by my late husband. After you stood up to her, I let them grow back the way they were meant to be." Stories like that reminded me why I had fought so hard. It was not really about the heating system, although that was the catalyst. It was about the principle that homeowners should have basic rights and should not be subjected to arbitrary, abusive enforcement of rules. The Arizona Department of Real Estate completed their investigation and issued a report highly critical of the management practices at Pleasant Valley Estates during Patricia's tenure. They implemented new training requirements for HOA board members across the state and strengthened oversight procedures. Again, my case had contributed to positive systemic change. I settled into a comfortable routine in my home. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company in Tempe, which was about a 30-minute commute from Chandler. My job was interesting and paid well, which had enabled me to afford both the house and the renovations in the first place. On weekends, I would work on other improvement projects around the house, though nothing as major as the radiant floor heating. I upgraded the landscaping in my backyard, creating a nice outdoor living space with a pergola and some desert-appropriate plants. This time, I did not have to worry about some petty tyrant showing up to question my choices. I also started dating someone I met through a friend, a teacher named Laura Collins who lived across town. When I told her the whole story about the HOA situation, she could not believe it. "They actually tried to tell you that your heating system was too expensive," she asked, laughing in disbelief. "What kind of logic is that? The logic of someone who thinks they should control every aspect of other people's lives," I replied. Laura came over often, and she loved the radiant floor heating, especially on cool evenings. "This is amazing," she would say, walking around barefoot on the warm floors. "I can see why you were willing to fight for it." As our relationship grew more serious, we started talking about the future. Laura loved my house and the neighborhood, which had really transformed under the new HOA leadership. We talked about her eventually moving in and maybe down the road getting married. "Would you be okay living in a place with an HOA after everything you went through?" she asked me one evening. "The HOA is not the problem," I said. "Bad leadership is the problem. With good people in charge, an HOA can actually enhance a community. It just takes eternal vigilance to make sure power-hungry people do not take over." 2 years after the initial confrontation with Patricia, I was elected to the HOA board myself. I had not planned on it, but several neighbors encouraged me to run, saying they wanted someone with my perspective and backbone on the board. I agreed, figuring it was a good way to ensure the positive changes continued. Serving on the board gave me a new appreciation for the challenges of governing a community. There were legitimate disputes that needed resolution, like neighbors disagreeing about fence placement or concerns about noise levels. The key was addressing these issues fairly and reasonably, without power trips or hidden agendas. One of my first acts as a board member was to propose a homeowner Bill of Rights that would be incorporated into our governing documents. It spelled out clearly what rights homeowners had, including the right to make interior modifications without approval, the right to due process before fines were assessed, and the right to access all HOA records and financial information. The proposal passed unanimously, and we sent copies to every household in the development. It was my way of ensuring that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else in Pleasant Valley Estates. Life continued on, and the drama of those early months faded into memory, though it never completely disappeared. I would occasionally get calls from reporters doing stories about HOA reform, and I was always happy to share my experience. I felt like I had a responsibility to speak up, to use my platform to help others who were facing similar situations. One particularly satisfying moment came when the Arizona legislature passed a new law strengthening homeowner protections and increasing penalties for HOA board members who misused their authority. The bill specifically cited several cases, including mine, as examples of why the legislation was necessary. I was invited to the signing ceremony at the state capitol in Phoenix, and I shook hands with the governor as he signed the bill into law. "Thank you for standing up for homeowners," the governor said to me. "Stories like yours show why these protections are so important." I thanked him and watched as he signed the bill, thinking about how far things had come from that morning when Patricia showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture me about my heating system. My relationship with Laura continued to grow, and eventually we got engaged. We decided to keep living in my house in Chandler, which had become our home together. The radiant floor heating was a particular selling point for her, which always made me smile. "I am marrying you partially for your heating system," she would joke. "Is that wrong?" "As long as you also love me for my sparkling personality and rugged good looks," I would reply, and we would laugh together. Planning the wedding gave us something joyful to focus on after all the stress and negativity of the legal battles. We decided to have the ceremony at a beautiful venue in Scottsdale, with a reception overlooking the desert landscape. Many of our neighbors from Pleasant Valley estates were invited, including Derek, Susan, James, and others who had supported me through the ordeal. At the reception, Derek gave a toast that referenced the whole situation. "I have known Brian for a few years now," he said, "and I can tell you he is a man of principle. When he could have backed down and taken the easy path, he stood up for what was right. That takes courage, and it is one of the many reasons I am proud to call him my friend." To Brian and Laura, everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a wave of gratitude for the community of friends and neighbors who had stood by me. The whole experience, as difficult as it had been, had brought me closer to people, and had taught me valuable lessons about courage, integrity, and the importance of fighting for what you believe in. As Laura and I danced our first dance as a married couple, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. If Patricia had not shown up that morning to complain about my heating system, my life might have taken a very different path. I might never have become friends with Derek or Susan. I might never have discovered my capacity to stand up to injustice. I might never have met Michelle, the lawyer who became not just my attorney but a friend and mentor. In a strange way, I was almost grateful to Patricia for pushing me to my limit. She had forced me to find strength I did not know I had, and in doing so, she had inadvertently made me a better, stronger person. Of course, I still would not recommend the experience to anyone. Fighting an abusive HOA is exhausting, stressful, and all-consuming. But if you find yourself in that situation, I hope my story shows that it is possible to win, that justice can prevail, and that standing up for your rights is worth the struggle. After the wedding, Laura and I settled into married life in our home in Chandler. We talked about eventually starting a family, and we knew this was the perfect place to raise children. The neighborhood was safe, friendly, and now properly governed. The parks and community facilities were well maintained, and there was a real sense of community among the residents. I continued to serve on the HOA board, working with other reasonable people to keep the community running smoothly. We focused on the basics, maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable rules fairly, and being good stewards of the homeowner's money. There was no drama, no power trips, just sensible governance. Sometimes I would walk through my house in the evening, feeling the warmth from the radiant floor heating beneath my feet, and I would marvel at how something so simple had sparked such a significant chain of events. My heating system had cost $40,000, which Patricia had deemed too expensive and none of my business to install. In standing up to her assertion that she had the right to question my private spending, I had uncovered corruption, changed laws, and helped protect the rights of homeowners across Arizona. The lesson, I suppose, is that small stands for principle can have large consequences. When Patricia told me my radiant floor heating was too expensive, and I told her it was none of her business, I was asserting a basic right, the right to make decisions about my own property without unwarranted interference. That simple assertion of rights led to everything else. Years from now, when people ask me about the whole situation, I will tell them it was never really about the heating system. It was about freedom, autonomy, and the right to live in your own home without being harassed by petty bureaucrats. It was about standing up to bullies, even when it is hard. It was about justice and accountability. And yes, it was also a little bit about having the most comfortable floors in the entire neighborhood during the winter months. That part was pretty great too.